here at the former NYU Poly, now Faculty of Engineering. I'm also the President and CEO of the World Wildlife Fund Canada, and in a previous life was the Mayor of Toronto, Canada. I'm delighted to welcome everybody to today's conference. I think the panels are going to be terrific, interesting, and also speak very directly to a very important challenge of our time that I'll speak more about in a moment by way of introductory remarks. First of all, I do want to acknowledge that this conference is organized by the Department of Technology, Culture and Society at the NYU Polytechnic School of Engineering, formerly NYU Polytechnic Institute. The Department of Technology, Culture and Society offers degrees in sustainable urban environments and in integrated digital media, as well as in science and technology studies. More information about these degree programs is available on flyers in the lobby if you're interested, or please ask one of the faculty members who are moderators for today's conference about information if you're interested. And the structure of this department is quite relevant to today's conference topic. And my interest personally arises not just from my role here at NYU Poly, but also from a history of environmental activism in elected office, and now at the World Wildlife Fund Canada. And I've been puzzled by some of the challenges we face on environmental issues that don't seem to be capable of resolution in ways that would seem obvious if we simply believe the facts or the science. The largest one, of course, is climate change. IPCC reports coming out literally as we speak are showing that the threat is even deeper than we thought, particularly to species and to people living in developing countries. Those the least off have the largest risk. Yet polls consistently show that nearly 50% of Americans don't believe climate change exists. In Canada, fortunately, the figures are a little different. Only 25% of the people don't believe climate change exists. Yet 40 years ago, we were able to mobilize Americans and Canadians to provide real solutions to environmental challenges. And the question I've been asking myself is why today, with more and more ways we can communicate, does it seem to be more and more difficult to succeed in overcoming these challenges? Is it about the fact that the environmental movement for quite a while has often used fear and negativity as a motivating factor? We need to stop this dam. We need to stop this pipeline. We need to stop this oil from the tar sands. We need to stop fracking. Is it about the fact that we're not showing positive solutions and talking about hope instead of fear, the way President Obama did, particularly in his first campaign, appealing to people's better instincts? Is it the fact that in a digital world, there are so many different channels of communication that we haven't quite yet figured out how to get our message across? Or is it that we simply need to knock on doors and talk to people one-on-one like we did in the past when we succeeded in the United States in achieving the Clean Air Act? I don't know the answers to all of those questions, but I do know that the digital era gives us an incredible opportunity to connect with people in different and innovative ways, to help educate them, to help inspire them, and also to help them make the change that they believe in. And that's what this conference is about. And it's been structured in a very careful way. The first panel is about the art and science of persuasion. You know, what really works? Does fear work? Does hope work? Why do we see negative advertising all the time in political campaigns? Well, the sad news is it works, in a way. Although it also discourages people from participating in the political process, which, if you're an environmentalist, you want people to participate, so perhaps that wouldn't be a strategy we should undertake. You know, do we appeal to people's hearts or heads? Those kinds of issues and much more will be discussed by the first panel, and I'll introduce the moderator in a couple of minutes. The second panel and the third panel are going to be discussing issues of what digital strategies work in the case of the second panel. So some really good examples of things that have worked in mobilizing people to make real change on environmental issues. As you know, Some of our terrific students here at Poly will be showing us their presentations over lunch, and I very much look forward to those, and I find often we learn the most from students who are working innovatively, in this case on digital media projects to address environmental issues. They're doing exactly the work this conference is about. In the afternoon, we'll have more discussion about digital activism around environmental issues, and then a panel for lessons learned. I think this conference is quite important. It's certainly timely, and I'm not aware of anywhere else where we've pulled together people who can discuss the art of persuasion, people who can discuss digital activism, academics, and experts in information technology and communications. These skills coming together, I think, can help us actually seize the opportunity to motivate and mobilize people. The final point I want to say is Scott Liffin, who's here with me from World Wildlife Fund Canada, who's our IT director, gave me a copy of a newspaper article from yesterday from the National Post. Now, for those of you not from Canada, so everybody in the room other than Scott and I, the National Post is an extremely conservative newspaper that calls the bitumen deposits in Canada oil, not tar, for example, and runs frequent articles denying the science of climate change. Yesterday, they ran an article about the new IPCC report and quoted one of the lead scientists for the report, Chris Field, as saying that because so many of the impacts of climate change are negative, we need to find a way to approach the issue with more positive thinking. Climate change is as rich with opportunity as it is with danger, he said. If dealing effectively is taking an innovative, creative, entrepreneurial approach, building great businesses and communities, then it's a problem we can deal with. And really, on that issue, the question will come down to, are we going to motivate people to understand by fear, or are we going to motivate people to understand by hope that there's a much better future for us in our cities and communities if we respond positively? And I found it fascinating that the day before this conference, somebody from the International Panel on Climate Change would make exactly that point. So those are the kinds of issues we're going to speak about today. My purpose in speaking was to welcome you, to introduce the topic, to remind you that the washrooms are that way somewhere. I don't know exactly where they are, but there are signs. And to remind you that lunch is at 12:30 to 1:30, but there are student presentations, and we really urge you to come and see the presentations. They're going to be excellent, combining all of this work. And it's in that spirit that I'd now like to introduce my colleague, Kristen Day, who is head of the Department of Technology, Culture and Society here at NYU. In effect, she is my boss. Being a former mayor, I'm not used to having a boss, but I have to say that if you want to have a boss, Kristen is the best you could possibly have. A terrific academic and leader in her own right. Chris, please come up for the first panel. Thank you very much.
All right, welcome everyone. We're delighted to see you here, and I'm going to jump right into the content for our first panel. As David mentioned, we're going to start with a review about what is known about the art and science of persuasion. So the goal of this first panel and the experts that we've gathered to address it is to frame our conversation before we start thinking in detail about what sorts of digital strategies work and don't work and how they work and so forth. We want to hear from the leading social scientists and others in environmental fields about what we know about how we educate, how we change attitudes, how we build a case for concern and action around these environmental issues. So I'd like to invite the first panel to come up and join us. I'm going to introduce the speakers very briefly, so you can use a few of your minutes if you like to tell us a little bit more about yourselves. This first panel, let's see, includes Edward Maybach, who's the director of the Center for Climate Change Communication at George Mason University, Beth Carlin, who's the director for the Transformational Media Lab at the University of California, Irvine, Jennifer Tabinico, who's the president of Action Research, and Irina Fejina, who's an APAAS Science and Technology Congressional Fellow. So if we could have all four of you come up and join us, and then unless you have another preference, we'll just invite you to speak in the order that you're listed. We'll have time for a question or two after each speaker, and then we've reserved a block of time at the end of the panel for more robust questions and answers.
Color this morning. So I'm going to try to follow suit with my good friend Chip Heath. He says that if you say three things, you've said nothing. Okay, he said that in his book with his brother Chip and Dan Heath, Made to Stick. You've said three things, you've said nothing. So I'm going to try to say one thing this morning. And the one thing that I want to leave you with, and there will be a test at the end. You're right. That sort of, if we know anything about effective public communication, using communication to educate people, to engage them, to mobilize them, this is the one thing we know. Simple, clear messages repeated often by a variety of trusted sources. I extracted this lesson from my 25 years of work in the public health community before I started working on climate change. The literature is pretty clear. I mean, you won't actually find this written anywhere in the academic literature, but all of the practitioners, all of the people who've been working to use communication on behalf of improving the public's health, they all know this to be true, and they've gotten really good at implementing it. But we've seen incredible strides globally in terms of reducing HIV infection, seen incredible strides globally in terms of, at least in the US and certain countries, in terms of reducing tobacco use, passenger safety restraints, motorcycle safety, on and on and on. And all of those issues have really found their way to embrace this notion of simple, clear messages repeated often by a variety of trusted voices. But I'm also going to try, thank you.
If you wanted.
Well, do you need me on a mic? You do, okay. So I'm going to skirt the if you've said three things, you've said nothing rule by breaking my one thing down into three meditations on the one thing, okay? Because simple, clear messages repeated often by a variety of trusted voices actually is a sentence with three parts. So let me just give you a little bit of elaboration on the first part. Simple, clear messages. Why is that so important? Well, as sort of Chip and Dan have already foreshadowed, the less we say, the more we are heard. It's a sort of a conundrum or a paradox of human communication. We think that the more we say, the more we will be heard. And clearly, anytime you have expert-driven communication, and environmentalism is not always expert-driven, sometimes it's just the opposite. But when you get the experts in, when you get the what I'm going to call in a moment the content experts, the people who have sort of the knowledge of the underlying scientific issues, they know a lot about the problem, and they tend to want to share a lot about the problem. The problem with their instinct is the more they share, the less they are heard. So simple, clear means getting it down to the most important pieces of information to share. And it isn't the most important pieces of information to share according to the expert. It's the most important piece of information to share according to the member of the target audience, the person you are trying to share with, which means we actually can't just make this stuff up. We can't lock ourselves in a room and decide what our simple, clear messages ought to be. We can do that, we often do that, but we run the risk of failing to engage members of our target audience and finding out, using an empirical lens to ascertain what information is going to be of most value to them in coming to understand that there is an issue, that there's an issue that warrants response, and coming to understand what that response might be. So we have to identify, get it down to the essence. We have to turn to members of our target audience to figure out what that essence is. And ultimately, as I've already sort of foreshadowed, audience research, sort of the systematic application of social science research is our tool, our greatest tool in figuring out which of those simple, clear messages are going to make the biggest difference. So that the second part of my one point, the message repetition, why it is so important to repeat and repeat and repeat. It simply comes down to the fact that that is the way our brains are wired. We need to hear things frequently before we start to incorporate it into our own thinking. Moreover, cognitive psychologists talk about the mere exposure effect. The more we are exposed to an idea, the more we come to like it, the more we come to understand it, the more we come to like it, the more we come to trust it, and the more we come to incorporate it into our thinking. And it isn't just with regard to information, actually. For those of you who have children or are raising children, you know that the way to get your children to enjoy vegetables is you keep putting the vegetables on their plate, night after night after night. And at first it doesn't go so well, but eventually they come to like those vegetables. I have a 23-year-old son now who is, he's taken all of that vegetarianism that I incorporate into my own life, and he's taken it now to the 10th factor, and he shames me at the laxity of my own diet. So in his case, the mere exposure exceeded my wildest expectations about just how effective that could really be. So with regard to repetition, we don't always have to say it the same way. Although those of you who are familiar with the right-wing echo chamber, where you've got Fox News and various conservative pundits and people who write op-eds in conservative newspapers, they do tend to say the same thing over and over and over again in more or less the same way. They're very good at it. They're very clever because they've learned that simple, clear messages repeated often tend to get picked up, tend to be incorporated into people's own thought processes, and then tend to be shared with, sort of interpersonally through the hierarchy or the chain of interpersonal communication. And so while we don't always have to say it the same way, to a greater or lesser degree, when we can be disciplined and say it over and over again in more or less the same way, we can elaborate on it, but it really is that act of repetition that changes the way people think in subtle ways, but over time in really important and profound ways. And then the third point that the third elaboration on this second point is that it's helpful when we can say it in more than just words. Metaphors are words, but metaphors are words that invoke visual images for us, embodied understanding of the world. So when we can sort of explain it in one way, reinforce it with a metaphor, possibly also reinforce it through visual communication by showing imagery, none of which I'm doing for you today, but by showing imagery that reinforces it, all of those things are ways of repeating that ultimately will help members of your target audience understand, come to like, and to trust what you are saying. And then the third and final aspect of my one point, which is conveying it through a variety of trusted sources or trusted voices. Whoever you are probably trusted by some and probably not trusted by others. Whomever you are trying to reach, you would be very well served by figuring out who they trust and trying to recruit them as the voices who are conveying the information you have to share. So your first job is to determine who is most trusted, and find ways of engaging them as your messengers. They may or may not be motivated to do so. They may or may not be capable of doing so, but the more, what we know is the more we are willing to adapt to those trusted messengers by making the ask of them, by making the information we would like them to share easy for them to share, the more likely we are to actually reach the eventual members of the target audience with the information we want to share. And the ultimate acid test, in my opinion, of our success is when the people we are trying to reach, members of our target audience, start sharing the information with other members of our target audience. Because the most trusted source of information on any topic for almost every person on the planet is the people they know and love and care about the most, i.e. their family members and their friends. And this is true of climate change, this is true of biodiversity. This is true of every issue that anybody in this room works on or cares about. People trust the people they know most, even if the people they know have zero expertise or basis for an informed opinion. So our ultimate success is making sure that our simple, clear messages get repeated by members of our target audience. So let me give you one last elaboration on this one theme. This is my good friend Baruch Bischoff. He's a risk communication expert at Carnegie Mellon. In 2007, he wrote an article that just changed my world. There's the reference, we called it Non-Persuasive Communication About Matters of Greatest Urgency. And Baruch says, after many years of work as an expert and a practitioner, Baruch feels that the formula for us to get better at identifying simple, clear messages that we can try to get repeated often through a variety of trusted voices is to form a team. The members of the team will be content experts, people who understand biodiversity challenges or climate change or any of the issues that you work on. So that the content experts or the scientists. The second member of the team would be social scientists, or what Baruch calls decision scientists. People like myself and other members of the panel who we study how people understand information. And then the third member of the team would be communication experts, people who know how to get information out there into the real world, into the lives of people, so that they will see it with sufficient repetition, that they will start to begin to think about it. And it's this cooperation among three totally different types of professionals that begins to allow you to achieve what I've summarized as simple, clear messages repeated often by a variety of trusted sources. So let me give you a current example, and this is really current. It's sort of all playing out right now. So for any of you who have your laptops open, you might want to go to what we know. See what the blogosphere is saying about it right now. I'll clue you into a bit of it. But this is an initiative by the AAAS, American Academy for the Advancement of Science. The report was released 2 weeks ago yesterday, I believe, and it was an effort to preface the IPCC report, which was released yesterday, and to preface the National Climate Assessment, the third assessment of the National Climate Assessment, which will be released on April 28th, of which I'm a member of that process. And this was an effort to make a few simple, clear points before the media machine got cranked up, in an effort to share all of the incredible details that are in the IPCC report and in the National Climate Assessment report. So we set out to share a couple of simple, clear messages, and we had to figure out what those simple, clear messages were going to be. And I was a member of the team that developed this. I was the social scientist on the team, and I started the conversation with essentially my research findings, which are depicted here, which is that with regard to a whole lot of different things that environmental activists care about, the belief that we should, pertains to climate change only in this case, but the belief that we should respond to climate change as a society, support for climate policies, because we're not going to solve the problem without the right policies, and then personal engagement in encouraging elected officials to enact those policies. All three of these things are supported. People who do these things, they tend to believe that climate change is real, it's human caused, it's bad for people, and it's solvable. All of the points that we've already heard about this morning. And then my research also showed that there's one more belief that's particularly important, and in fact I believe it's most important, because people who hold this belief tend to also hold these other four beliefs, and also tend to feel we should be responding and are personally rolling up their sleeves and getting involved in trying to encourage a response. And that is the understanding, this most fundamental of beliefs, is the understanding that there is no debate among the experts about climate change. Virtually all of the experts understand now that human-caused climate change is happening. And so what I wanted to get out of this What We Know campaign is to convey the scientific consensus, because my data shows that among Americans, that is the single most important communication objective that we could achieve. that was what I brought to the table. This is what actually came out the other side, a report that made 3 points. The first point was the scientific consensus message. Climate scientists agree, climate change is happening here and now. The second point was a point brought by by many of the climate scientists that we involved on the team. They felt that the most important thing that they knew that members of the public do not understand, by and large, is the potential for abrupt climate change. That climate change isn't just going to happen in an incremental, linear, slow fashion, as it has been happening in an incremental, linear, slow fashion over the past 50 years, but in fact there's potential where we can get dramatic change very quickly. And they feel like that is the ultimate risk management question that has to be addressed, and so the climate experts wanted to make sure that that was on the table. And then our communication experts made very much the same point that you opened with, which is this can't all be, we don't want to invoke too much fear. We want to make sure that we're invoking the can-do spirit. We're building a sense of response efficacy, collective efficacy. And that's the third message, is that the sooner we act, the lower the risk and the cost, and there really is much we can do. We tested these messages, various ways of conveying these messages, until we found the ways that actually were most successful in changing people's understanding of the scientific consensus, and in fact changing each of these, what I call the big 5 beliefs. So we came together as a team, we identified the 3 ideas that we felt were most important to convey, and then we put them under the microscope, if you will, and we really systematically tested until we understood exactly how best to convey those 3 points. So that it launched 2 weeks ago. I just pulled off of Twitter a couple of my favorite responses. Tom Friedman jumped right on it, the head of Department of Defense, our Undersecretary for Energy, she jumped on it. John Doerr, a very influential venture capitalist from Silicon Valley, he jumped on it. None of these people have the following, ironically, of Mark Ruffalo, the actor, he jumped on it. He's got something like 2 million followers. And then National Review, a conservative publication, jumped on it to say this is as we would predict them to say. At any rate, it's created quite an interesting conversation in the blogosphere, with most of the Twitter comments being very close to one or more of the 3 of those key messages, which is nice. It meant we succeeded. Monday, the editorial page of the New York Times also commented on it. They commented on it in the context of the newly released IPCC report. I won't go into it, but let's just say that they too managed to get one hit on one of the 3 key messages. So we were quite pleased with the whole thing. We feel like, and we're continuing to work those messages, work that process. But those are the 3 key messages that we feel are most important for Americans to understand going forward as they continue. So it's not just a one-time only release. We're going to work it and work it and work it, and hopefully AAAS's commitment to working those 3 messages on an ongoing basis will remain strong. We need them. They're the face of this initiative. We need them to press on. So I didn't tell you there was going to be a test at the end, but there is a test at the end. So what is the principle? I'm going to actually, you've been incredibly attentive throughout. So what is the key principle? What was my one message?
A clear message repeated over and over by diverse experts.
All right, very good. Simple, clear messages repeated often by a variety of trusted sources. That's the one thing I wanted to share with you. And thank you for your attention.
Okay, we have time to take, let's take one question for Ed right now, and then we'll have time for additional questions at the end of the panel. So would somebody like to start with a question?
So I have a question. The way that Fox News does it, where they have everybody literally saying the same thing, does that sort of get in the way of that, and that it makes it sound canned as opposed to people saying it the same message but maybe in their own voice?
No, it does not get in the way. Actually, it's incredibly effective, and it only makes it sound canned when somebody goes to the effort of taking all the video snippets and lining them up, side by side, and making the point that, look, these people are somebody's voice. These people are the tool of somebody else, and look at how good they are at being that person or that organization's tool. But in terms of, even when that happens, you know, it's just the way the human mind works. The more it is said, the more deeply ingrained it gets. And even when it is said in the with the intention of debunking what they're saying by actually repeating their words and showing lots of different people repeat the words, they're simply reinforcing the fundamental the mental model that they were intending to create in the first place. So debunking myths, like the myth, it was the right-wing echo chamber that ultimately created this myth, the most widely held myth in America about climate change, that there's a lot of disagreement among the experts. That is exactly how they created that myth. But every time somebody mentions the disagreement, it simply reinforces the frame that that was intentionally created. So the way the only tool we really have to combat that is to show that kind of message discipline in terms of asserting the truth. So what we found in our research is actually the most effective way to assert the truth. Based on the evidence, more than 97% of climate experts are now convinced that human-caused climate change is happening. Those exact words were the most effective way we tested about a dozen different ways of making the point. And by priming with that initial clause based on the evidence, that is how scientists reach conclusions. They look at evidence. So by priming for scientific reasoning, we actually got, you can get about a 20 percentage point bump. The average American thinks the consensus is about the rate of agreement, the level of agreement is about 60%. In fact, it's 97% or higher. But through a single exposure to that message, by priming based on the evidence, more than 97%, giving a specific number, more than 97% of the climate scientists are now convinced that human-caused climate change is occurring. We can move that estimate from about 60% to 80, 85, and in some cases as much as 90%. So these are essentially the tools that people with different opinions than our own have perfected first, but it's contingent upon us to learn how to use these tools well as well.